Hello world. Today I will be talking about learning Mandarin, or if you need to learn or know Mandarin. If you're coming to China to visit, if you're coming to live, if you're an expat, if you're planning to stay here long term, I'm going to go over all of that. This footage is taken from my trip to Suzhou, and we'll see how much of it we get through. So, do you need to speak Mandarin Chinese if you plan to visit or live in China? The simple answer is no. If you're planning to visit China, you do not need to speak Chinese. And even if you plan to live in China, you do not need to speak fluent Mandarin. However, your life will dramatically improve if you're willing to go the extra mile. So I'm going to start with tourists, short-term stays, but a lot of this is going to be applicable in the later groups too. However, I'll go into more depth for each of them. So for tourists, you'll be fine without Mandarin. Airports, trains, hotels, most tourist areas are completely manageable. Menus often have pictures, sometimes they have English translations depending where you are. Translation apps can cover you in most situations. That being said, I would recommend the basic courtesies, how to say hello, thank you, maybe if you learn how to ask for directions. Some tourists seem to be intimidated by China, but I would say don't let the language barrier intimidate you. Not everyone speaks English, but in some of the main tourist areas, you're more likely to find it. And what you'll find more often than not is that Chinese people are quite hospitable and willing to help you out. On that note, and I'm not going to say it never happens, but I haven't been scammed when buying something. I haven't had anybody inflate the price. Even when I clearly didn't understand, I could give them my phone and they'd type in the proper price. And you could tell it wasn't inflated if you know anything about the prices. You might want to keep an eye on that, but again, I've never had any trouble with it. That being said, no matter where you are in the world, always be vigilant in tourist areas because, hey, tourists are easy targets. I'm going to get on to if you're actually living in China, but for any tourists or travelers, this is partially going to be relevant to you as well. So where you live or wherever you're visiting matters a lot. If you're visiting a first-tier city, it's going to be a lot different than being somewhere out in the countryside or somewhere where you see a lot less foreigners or tourists. So if you're in a very international city like Shanghai, you're going to have signs in Mandarin and English. Most people speak basic English. However, it's not going to be as English friendly as somewhere like Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And you definitely can't depend on everyone speaking English. Now, that being said, even in smaller or more remote cities, you can still get by. People may speak less English, but locals tend to be patient and accommodating. So translation apps and goodwill really go a long way. So no, Mandarin is not a hard requirement, even outside major cities. But the trade-offs become more noticeable the more you get away from these international venues. You don't need to be superb in Mandarin before you come here. However, I do recommend you do some research on the culture and history, just so you have a bit of an understanding and better know what to expect once you actually come here. I would also recommend having a look at the laws and regulations that may differ from your home country, just so you don't get into any unnecessary trouble. Now, let's actually get into what it's like for expats and long-term residents. The conversation totally changes here. If you're living in China long-term, especially as an expat, you can survive without Mandarin, but you'll be limited. I want you to know you'll be giving up a significant portion of your personal power if you decide not to learn at least conversational Mandarin. Without Mandarin, social life tends to stay in that expat bubble. Most interactions become very limited because you'll only be speaking with other foreigners or Chinese people who already speak English. This is particularly prevalent in the English teacher community. They speak English for work. They essentially never have to speak Mandarin if they don't want to or are not caught in a situation where they have to. And this is where comfort and convenience end up functioning as a double-edged sword. Because everything's so convenient, you can go to a restaurant, scan QR codes, everything can be done on your phone. You can even use a translator to translate those digital menus. You never have to really interact with people if you don't want to. This can be great if you're just not having it that day, but it can get a little too comfortable when you avoid everyone. So because of the convenience, the comfort, and the bubbles that tend to form around a lot of the expat and international community, a lot of them don't really end up learning Mandarin. And I get it, it's a hard language to learn. Now, locals don't usually expect you to know Mandarin or to learn it. So you usually get a pass if you're not able to communicate. However, if you show that willingness or you're able to communicate on a basic level, you usually get really positive feedback, which in my case really encourages me to continue to learn more. For a lot of temporary residents, they don't see it as it's a worthy investment. Maybe they're just going to stay in China a year or two. I'd actually argue that if you're here and you learn the language, Mandarin's always going to be useful no matter where you go in the world. If you are just here temporarily, maybe you're not going to focus on learning Mandarin. In that case, it's still important you respect the culture and you express some humility. Don't come here acting like everyone needs to accommodate you and you don't speak the language. No, you need to understand that you're in a foreign land and things might be an inconvenience sometimes when you don't speak the language. That's the reality of coming to a new place. You might get heavy into your routines. You go to the same stores, you take the same routes, you talk to the same people. Everything works until it doesn't or something goes wrong. For myself, I was in the subway. I was not able to scan out. Something on my app wasn't working. And I had to go talk with the subway staff, and they were very accommodating, but it was a little bit of an obstacle, although I looked at it as a chance to actually practice some of my Chinese with the staff. But if I was a local person or I spoke fluent Mandarin, I could just go up. The problem would have been solved. Rather than in 5 to 10 minutes, it would have been like 30 seconds. In China, Mandarin gives you independence and really lets you leverage that convenience to the point it becomes hyper convenience. So China is very phone-based. QR cards, as I said, for menus, rather than ordering menus and running it through a translator, you can read it, you can recognize characters, you're not slowed down. You understand what you're clicking, you're not relying on pictures, you can search, you can book things, you can order online, you don't need to get your friends to do it for you or your spouse or anything like that. The more you learn, the more you march towards freedom. Language essentially unlocks convenience and freedom. Anyone who spends a long time abroad or goes to a country where their language isn't the dominant language or they don't know how to speak the dominant language undergoes this, whether it's going to the West or whether you're coming here to China. A lot of English speakers haven't really experienced this because English is so ubiquitous, it's so globally spoken. We often are able to ride on the fact that everybody speaks a little bit or enough of it so we can get by. And I think living abroad is often romanticized. And yes, it can be amazing, but moving to a country where you don't speak the dominant language means you are giving up a form of power. If you value your independence or your self-reliance, it can be frustrating because you might have to depend on others for the first bit. You might need to have to ask coworkers, you might need to have to ask friends, and it can get annoying. I remember one of the first times I visited China, I was passing by a restaurant and I opted not to eat because I thought, I'm not in the mood to go in it and try to get my point across to this guy. So I went home and I'm like, I'll get something for breakfast. And I just went to sleep. You have to be comfortable being a fish out of water, because the fact is, maybe you're a social guy back home. If you're hanging out with locals or people who don't speak English and everyone's speaking Mandarin around you, you're gonna need a time to slow down and be okay with not understanding everything that's going on around you. You might not be able to crack the same jokes you made back home. You might not be able to interact. You might not be able to approach people and strike up conversations. So you have to accept that you might not be the same person you were back home, at least for a while you are limited in your self-expression. 100% in my opinion, if you are planning to stay here long term, or if you're not sure, learning Mandarin does seem like the best bet. In my opinion, I am planning to go full in on it, study more, learn more. I want
fluency. I might never be as good as a native speaker, but I want to get to the point where I feel that I can be myself in Mandarin. I would actually warn against retreating to those VPN expat life bubbles because it stymies your growth. It's not a path to growth. I know we all have different reasons why we go abroad. I would just like everyone to consider, what is that reason? Maybe if you're an older person, you're like, you know what, it's not in the cards for me. Do what's within reason at the end of the day. And for my unsolicited opinion on how I would break this down, I'd say tourists, you don't need to learn Mandarin, but anything helps. If you're in a big city, it's manageable without it. Smaller cities, it's possible, but it's going to be a little bit limiting. But for anybody here long term, Mandarin does equal freedom, whether you want to learn it or not. You don't need to learn Mandarin to live in China, for sure, absolutely not. But if you want independence, confidence, and a fuller life, I think you should learn it, and you would dramatically benefit from it. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this walk.